when the commander-in-chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps declared, before the cameras of state television in Tehran, that the country had consolidated a continuous maritime belt from the Strait of Hormuz to the Red Sea, the statement was not received as platform rhetoric. It was received as the public confirmation of a military architecture that Western analysts had been mapping for months. And that, from that declaration forward, ceased to be an intelligence hypothesis and became official doctrine. The numbers underpinning that declaration are what transform a general's phrase into a crisis of civilizational scale. The Strait of Hormuz, roughly 53 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, a distance an oil tanker crosses in just over 2 hours, is the corridor through which approximately 21% of all the petroleum consumed on the planet passes every single day. The Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, at the other end of the announced belt, at the mouth of the Red Sea, concentrates between 12 and 15% of global maritime trade. Together, these two choke points represent potential control over nearly 1/3 of all the energy and all the goods that move by water in the world. Consider what that number means in practice. 1/3, not of a single commodity, not of a single route, of the entire maritime flow that sustains the contemporary global economy. The central paradox of this Iranian strategy was twofold and interlocked in a way that few analysts were articulating with the clarity the data deserved. The first layer was the most visible. Iran, an economy strangled by decades of American and European sanctions, with a GDP that, according to International Monetary Fund estimates, did not exceed $680 billion, smaller than Poland's, was announcing the capacity to threaten commercial routes that move trillions. The asymmetry was the weapon itself. The second layer, however, was more corrosive and far less visible. Every time the Tehran regime activated that belt, every time a Houthi drone struck a tanker or a naval mine was detected near Hormuz, the price of oil rose, and Iran, which continued selling its own petroleum at a discount to China and India through channels parallel to the sanctions, profited from the instability it was itself creating. The weapon threatening global commerce was, simultaneously, the machine financing whoever operated it. The paradox had closed in on itself, but the true impact of this operation extended far beyond the numbers on the battlefield. To understand what the belt from Hormuz to the Red Sea meant operationally, it was necessary to examine the three links that composed it. The first link was the Strait of Hormuz itself, where the Revolutionary Guard's Navy, the IRGC-N, the naval arm of the regime's elite corps, maintained a fleet of more than 1,500 fast attack craft, speedboats armed with anti-ship missiles that cost a fraction of the price of any Western corvette, and that operated in swarms designed to overwhelm the defense systems of conventional warships. Each of those boats cost somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000, less than a single American Tomahawk missile. The second link was the Allied militias in Iraq and the medium-range ballistic missile stockpiles scattered across Iranian territory, capable of striking any American military base in the Persian Gulf in less than 12 minutes of flight time. The third link, and the most active in the months preceding the announcement, was the Houthis in Yemen, the group that had transformed the southern Red Sea into an undeclared war zone against international maritime shipping. And here was the data that conventional reports were not displaying with the frequency it deserved. According to surveys by Lloyd's List, the global reference in maritime intelligence, the cost of insurance for vessels crossing the Red Sea had increased more than 300% since the intensification of Houthi attacks, a spike that represented in practice between $300,000 and $500,000 in additional cost per transit for a large tonnage tanker. Dozens of ship owners simply abandoned the route and began circumnavigating the African continent via the Cape of Good Hope, adding between 10 and 14 days of travel and approximately $1 million in extra fuel per vessel. The Iranian belt did not need to sink fleets, it only needed to exist as a credible threat to reconfigure the economics of planetary maritime transport. The equation had changed. Step back for a moment and take in the full picture. Admiral Ali Reza Tangsiri, commander of the IRGCN, was the operational face of this doctrine. A career officer with more than 3 decades in the Revolutionary Guard and a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, Tangsiri had personally overseen the expansion of Iran's naval base network across strategic islands in the Persian Gulf, including Abu Musa and the Tunbs, territories disputed with the United Arab Emirates that functioned as forward observation and launch posts. This man is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate of what the Iranian doctrine of maritime access denial consumes: decades of investment in asymmetric warfare, calibrated to make the cost of any Western military operation in the Gulf too high to be politically sustainable. But there was a layer we had not yet touched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. The belt from Hormuz to the Red Sea was not merely a line of maritime threat. It was a nuclear negotiating instrument. Every escalation in the Red Sea, every ostentatious naval exercise in the Strait of Hormuz, every demonstration of Iranian ballistic missile range occurred in calculated synchrony with the negotiating cycles over Tehran's nuclear program. When talks advanced, maritime pressure eased. When talks stalled, a new incident emerged. According to analyses by the International Crisis Group, this correlation was not coincidence. It was the backbone of the regime's bargaining strategy. The maritime belt was the argument Iran brought to the table without ever needing to voice it aloud. The capacity to paralyze the global economy was the collateral that guaranteed the West would remain seated at the table. In the shadow of this monumental strategic error, the error of having allowed the belt to consolidate without a proportional response for years, one actor was watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning, with the frequency the data demanded: China. Beijing was, by a wide margin, the largest buyer of Iranian petroleum, absorbing between 80 and 90% of all of Iran's crude exports, according to estimates from Kepler, a maritime cargo tracking firm. It purchased at discounts reaching $15 below the Brent barrel price, a saving that, multiplied by a daily volume of approximately 1,500,000 barrels, represented a competitive advantage of billions of dollars per year for Chinese industry. The more unstable the Iranian maritime belt made the global energy market, the more expensive oil became for Europe, Japan, and South Korea, and the cheaper, in relative terms, the oil China was purchasing directly from Iran outside the sanctions framework. This is not merely a question of territory on a map, it is a question of who controls the energy arteries of the 21st century. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the oil crisis of 1973, when OPEC used the embargo as a weapon against the West, though that is the comparison any listener would expect. It is the corsair strategy of the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean between the 16th and 18th centuries, when smaller states technologically inferior to the great powers along the North African coast used the constant threat to commercial maritime traffic to extract tributes, the so-called peace gifts, from European powers that preferred to pay rather than risk the disruption of their trade routes. Two specific features illuminate the present. First, the corsairs never needed to defeat a European navy in open battle. It was sufficient that the cost of protecting each vessel individually be too high to sustain. Second, the system only collapsed when one power, the United States, in the war against Tripoli in 1805, decided that the cost of direct military action was lower than the indefinite cost of extortion. The question the Iranian belt posed in 2026 was precisely this: at what point would the cost of tolerance exceed the cost of confrontation? And here was what that layer revealed about the dimension that closed the encirclement. The Houthis, the most active link in the belt, were not an improvised group firing homemade rockets. According to reports from the United Nations panel of experts on Yemen, the arsenal operating in the Red Sea included Samad attack drones with a range exceeding 1,500 kilometers, anti-ship missiles based on Iranian technology derived from the Noor model, itself a reverse-engineered copy of the Chinese C-802 missile, and naval mine systems that could be launched from small civilian vessels indistinguishable from fishing boats. The average cost of each Samad drone, according to Western defense estimates, ranged between $20,000 and $30,000. The cost of intercepting it with an SM-2 missile fired from an American Navy destroyer exceeded $2 million. The cost ratio was approximately 1 to 100. With every successful intercept, the United States spent 100 times more than Iran had invested in the threat. Every additional day was one more day of pressure on the countries that most depended on that resource, and that would generate pressure on Washington that the White House, sooner or later, could not afford to ignore. And so we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. The belt had consolidated not because Iran was militarily superior to the powers patrolling those waters. It was not and would not be in any conventional scenario. It had consolidated because the Western response architecture was calibrated for a type of threat that no longer existed: fleets against fleets, navies against navies. What Iran had built was a distributed network, cheap, expendable, and politically deniable, drones that carry no flag, mines with no return address, militias that officially receive no orders from Tehran. The cost of dismantling that network was exponentially greater than the cost of maintaining it, and the political cost of escalating, with all the risks of an open conflict in the Persian Gulf, was a price no Western capital appeared willing to pay in an election year or outside of one. The era of cheap, feared attacks was not ended. It was institutionalized as state doctrine. What the announcement of the belt from Hormuz to the Red Sea established was not a new military capability. That capability had already existed in fragmented form for years. What it established was the public declaration that Iran regarded the two straits as a single system of pressure, operated in coordinated fashion, with the Houthis at the southern end and the Revolutionary Guard at the northern end functioning as the two jaws of the same pair of pliers. The strategic question this declaration leaves open is whether the United States, Europe, and the Gulf states will be capable of formulating a response that alters the cost equation before the belt becomes the new normal of global navigation, or whether, like the European powers before the Barbary corsairs, they will choose to pay the silent tribute of longer routes, costlier insurance, and an energy dependence increasingly vulnerable to a regime that has transformed instability into its most profitable export product. The jaws were already closed. The question was who would have the courage to force them open. If this analysis helps illuminate the board taking shape in the Gulf and the Red Sea, share it and leave a comment. How far will the West tolerate before it responds? And what would the real cost of that response actually be?